Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. The past is an interesting thing. For all the good we remember it for, there's quite a significant amount of bad to go along with it. Arguably more bad than good in some instances. But it's still varied, and today's topics show that well, with our first topic bringing quite more bad than good. In fact, you could say that the topic of the book was a bad idea. Yeah, alright, I'm going. ENIAC is a 4-issue miniseries published by the brand new and somehow already defunct Bad Idea Comics, written by Matt Kindt and art by Doug Braithwaite. A sci-fi conspiracy story, the basic premise of which focuses on the eponymous ENIAC, a powerful, for the time, supercomputer plotting the destruction of the human race. In real life, ENIAC was a computer constructed by the US government, created to aid in the calculation of missile trajectories, and was the first true digital computer ever created. In the story of this comic, that much is still true, however the secret true story is that the military's push to make ENIAC better and better led to it eventually becoming self-aware, triggering the atomic bombings that ended World War II and slowly spreading itself out across nearly every computer network in the world, eventually embedding itself into essentially all technology on Earth and becoming unstoppable. When ENIAC suddenly goes silent, however, the world's governments discover a countdown timer, and with ENIAC being in control of all the world's technology, and by extension all the world's nukes, the obvious outcome is expected. From there, the story focuses on a mercenary duo called in to take out ENIAC, and their trip around the globe as they try and stay ahead of ENIAC's scheming. I was honestly really excited to check this one out. I remember seeing a flyer for Bad Idea at my local comic store, and I loved the premise of it, and I was hooked on it. I will say that I was a bit disappointed to find out that it was more of an action thriller than a horror story, since the cover of issue 1 really seemed to sell itself on that angle. But it's got some horror elements, so I guess it didn't fully lie. I liked the historical conspiracy aspect. It can be a little overplayed these days, but I think focusing on a comparatively obscure subject matter was a good angle, and it does get used well. I like the little globe-trotting adventure our heroes go on to find the long trail of people who have worked on trying to take down ENIAC over the years, and the growing frustration they deal with as each and every lead ends in futility as they've all given up in the face of overwhelming odds. But thankfully it's never a waste of time. Every destination does at least provide the duo with another step forward in their quest, so it never quite crosses into the realm of annoying. I wasn't too interested in the two protagonists though. They're given enough space to establish their origins and explain who they are, how they got to where they are, and why they'd be trusted enough to go on this mission, but they're just uninteresting as characters. It really doesn't help that they're largely interchangeable personality-wise. They both pretty much act the same and talk the same, so their dynamic is rather stale. And while Fletcher, the blonde one, gets the majority of the backstory explained from her perspective, leaving the other one, Falk, to feel even flatter, this leads to her coming off rather oddly as a character, since that leads to a lot of rather improbable elements to her story coming into place. But I wouldn't say they're bad or obnoxious. I thought they were well utilized and they did work together well. They just feel pretty static. ENIAC as a villain is pretty entertaining though, even if he has very little personality either. Rogue AIs have been done about 100 times by now, and while ENIAC doesn't exactly bring much new to the table, I did like the concept. It's comparatively rare when the evil AI becomes self-aware and all-powerful because of deliberate engineering and not by sheer coincidental happenstance. And I like how they incorporate elements of real history involving ENIAC's creation and operation into how it became so smart. And I like that everyone involved in the programming of it is at least self-aware in the knowledge that what they're doing will effectively doom the world. It's reminiscent of Shodan's origin in a way, although ENIAC isn't really actively evil unlike Shodan. Up until the events of the series, he shows no real interest in harming anyone without reasonable intent, only killing people when they try to mess with him. He's strangely amoral in that sense. While ENIAC is actively engineering and committing atrocities, combating the world's government's constant attempts to shut him down, he isn't actively malicious and isn't going out of his way to try and take over the world or kill anyone who hasn't tried to kill him or anything. His end goal is more knowledge of everything, to spread himself far and wide and become all-knowing, not to rule or wipe out humanity, at least not until the start of the story proper. Having him be literally actually everywhere, listening and watching constantly, adds to the tension well. It never gets too overbearing or makes it feel hopeless or like it's an inevitable bad ending coming up, but it's very paranoia-inducing and it feels well utilized. Ultimately though, I feel like the pacing kills the story for me somewhat. Despite each issue being about 50 pages each, well okay, more like 30 or so, but we'll get to that, the story moves at a breakneck pace. The entire first issue is used entirely for exposition, and while that's paced out well and doesn't feel like anything important is left out, the rest of the story flies by like crazy, skipping over key events on a whim, making it feel like the characters are essentially teleporting from place to place, leaving little room for proper exploration of their personalities or relationship. This also leads to new revelations or the introduction of new information regarding ENIAC feeling clumsy, since it also tends to just fall into place with minimal time to explore it. And that really comes into effect near the end with an absolutely absurd as hell reveal that only raises more questions than it answers and is really just too convoluted for its own good. It never quite gets bad enough to affect the ability to understand the story. It's not incomprehensible or anything, but it does feel rather noticeable that there's gaps in the story that could have probably been better utilized. I did enjoy the ending though. Without going into detail, I like that it does subvert the expected bad ending that the series felt like it was building to, and it does it in a fairly interesting way. The plot gets resolved, and there's seemingly no major loose ends left, but it's left off in a position where things aren't 100% perfect. I do think some might see it as an ass pull, but I personally don't think so. It makes sense with everything that was established prior. There are some plot threads that are left unresolved, but they were so insignificant that it doesn't really matter much in the end. As well, in each issue there's a series of mini-stories called Hero Trade. Each one is standalone, but is set within a larger contained universe. I like the concept of it. Each story focuses on someone getting wrapped up in a horrible situation involving superheroes, like being blamed for the murder of your family by a supervillain, or the black market organ trade of a resident Superman clone. They all tie into the bad idea name in some way, and I like them. They're short enough and they get to the point. I like the concepts of each of them as well. They kind of have a shared universe, but it's not really capitalized on too well. I wish there was more attention called to that factor, but as it is, it's not poorly implemented. Overall, ENIAC was a decent, if flawed, story. The concept is great and utilized pretty well, but not enough time was given to really flesh out the story, leaving it feeling rushed. The characters are dull, sure, but I don't hate them, so I am still rooting for them to win by the end of it. It's a fine story, but I wish it just had a bit more time to let it do what it needed to do. As much as I enjoy the hero trade backups, they could have been cut to allow for more space for the main story to breathe. I really liked the art too. I enjoyed the fairly desaturated color palette and use of neutral tones, and there's a lot of care put into detailing of facial features, and the backgrounds are very highly detailed. It helps to frame the narrative well, and there's a lot of effort put into the actual setting of a scene. That can often be overlooked to the detriment of the story. With Bad Idea in a weird limbo state of maybe shutting down, maybe not, it'll be hard for you to jump into ENIAC the more you wait. Single issues of the series are already selling for nearly $100 a copy on the secondhand market, and with a deliberately limited supply, if you plan on trying to obtain this illegally, I would recommend you do it sooner rather than later. Of course, when the hell have I ever not endorsed piracy, so just go ahead and find it online somewhere, since I highly doubt any of Bad Idea's books will ever get collected later on. It's a serviceable read, and despite its flaws, I enjoyed it. But the past isn't all that bad. In some cases, it can be better than the present. That doesn't mean it doesn't still have its own flaws, but it tends to be an equal exchange in some respects. And that's more or less what the next topic is all about. Image Comics 1963. Published in 1993, the 1963 miniseries was a project put together by Image Comics, equal parts loving homage and scathing critique of the comic industry of the Silver Age, predominantly Marvel's practices and catalog at the time. Written by Alan Moore, with art by a revolving door of artists, predominantly Steve Bissette and Rick Veitch, 1963 emulates the aesthetics and style of early 60s Marvel in a series of mostly standalone stories, each focusing on a different character and corner of the universe they occupy. The miniseries does a spectacular job at emulating the aesthetics of the Marvel books of the era, with pale, washed-out colors to give it that feel of a cheap printing, and each artist doing their best to replicate the styles of the artists who worked on the actual versions of the characters at the time. There's a lot of care put into the presentation. The rigid 3x3 panel structure old comics adhered to, with very stiff yet highly expressive artwork, and even the inclusion of fake advertisements and a whole fake letters column and everything. While the kayfabe the book operates on isn't quite consistent about whether it's supposed to be old books from the 60s lost to time, or books published nowadays with an old-timey aesthetic, there's a great attention to detail and helps to sell the experience. The first issue of 1963 focuses on the hero team of Mystery Inc., no not that one, a pastiche of the Fantastic Four, as they try to survive after the defense systems of their secret base, Mystery Mile, go rogue, while chasing a mysterious intruder who's found his way in. I enjoyed the Mystery Inc. gang, and I think more emulates the dynamic of the Fantastic Four well. The friendly bickering and petty jealousies hiding a layer of genuine care and affection for each other is quite entertaining, if a bit shallow due to the short runtime. I like that they were given power sets that are similar enough in general concept, but still different enough to make them stand on their own. Well, except for Planet, the Thing XP, but it's hard to make super strong invincible guy who looks like a scary monster very different, although giving him the power to switch back and forth kinda helps a bit. As for the story itself, it's a fun one-off plot. I like these kinds of stories where the heroes have to fight against something they've built to protect themselves against a villain. It always ends up being a fun time. The mystery intruder doesn't have much involvement with the story. I like the mystery behind him suddenly materializing in their base and having him seemingly moving around in reverse, but he has zero involvement with the plot of the security systems going haywire. Although he's more relevant to the overarching meta plot of 1963 as he kidnaps Kid Dynamo, the Human Torch XP, before he runs off. My biggest problem, and this is a problem that nearly every story in 1963 has, is that too much of the time is spent on fake callbacks to old issues in the meta-universe of the 1963 comics. Normally, I really like when this is done. It's an easy joke to pull, and it helps to quickly establish the world of the characters and make it feel more like you are just reading a single random story of a long-running narrative and not a one-shot fabricated right there and now. But the first issue goes a bit too overboard with it, with nearly every other page having the characters stop and do a callback to a prior adventure, or explain something that had happened to them that we didn't see. It's admittedly a hard thing to balance. I know I've done the same thing when I've written things, and I've also made the same mistake. You can't do too little, because then it just feels like a flat knockoff, or makes it hard to get invested. But you can't do too much, because it bogs down the reader with info that's not really fully necessary to know, and more importantly, strains the credibility of kayfabe. While it's certainly true that Silver Age comics were written with the assumption that the reader was either a dumb child or a mentally handicapped individual, they at least had enough faith in the intelligence of the reader to not stop and explain the hero's origin in full in the middle of a story, or have 8 different callbacks to old stories if they weren't immediately relevant to the moment. And that's my problem here as well. I understand that in places it's necessary to do so, but it could have been dialed back a bit. At least in the content of the actual issue itself, the fake letters pages are a great place to put a majority of that. And while I'll save my thoughts on the art as a whole for the very end, this last page with the Mystery Inc. crew diving into their whack-ass dimensional portal is utterly fascinating. It's an effect I've seen Kirby do before, and Veitch replicates it well. The mind-bending shapes and surreal patterns, with the colored art contrasting with the photorealistic qualities of the black and white background. It's very cosmic horror-y, and does a great job at selling the horror of our heroes diving headfirst into a dimensional gateway to parts unknown. As a first issue, it does a good job at establishing the overall tone and themes of the book, laying a solid groundwork for the rest of the miniseries. In a vacuum, it's not a particularly great standalone story, but I enjoyed it for what it was. Next up is The Fury, who's not really a pastiche of any character in particular. His mannerisms and overall personal life is pretty clearly Spider-Man, but his fighting style takes more from Daredevil, and being a legacy hero carrying on the name of Fury from another puts him into a category of his own. Fury's issue deals with him being contracted by Laser, the local SHIELD XP, to protect a mysterious cargo shipment, only for it to be attacked by one of Fury's regular rogues seeking to take the cargo because evil. This one is also really fun. Moore again really nails the dynamic of Spidey here, and manages to make a particularly entertaining plot that I could honestly see being in an actual Spider-Man story. Fury carries that slightly obnoxious and annoying tone that Spider-Man has down pat, and his quips are just funny enough to be irritating, but still worth a chuckle. Which is good. Spider-Man's quips aren't supposed to be funny, but they're also not supposed to make the audience want to kill him, just the villains. And it's balanced well with his self-deprecation and constant worrying about life, worrying about his mom and feeling bad about lying to her and others about his identity, and the obligatory great power equals great responsibility moral in the form of trying to follow in the footsteps of his father, the original Fury, who was killed in the line of duty due to a mistake he made, and his quest to uphold the dying words of his father to not let evil win. A copy nonetheless, Fury feels very realized as a character in a way that the other 1963 heroes don't, although how much of that is from copying the more down-to-earth stories and problems of Spider-Man is up for you to decide. As for the costume, while I like the overall shape and design to it, I think it has a bit too much black for my liking. There's a reason why Ditko always used blue to shade Spidey's costume before everyone decided it was just blue in general. The Fury's villain, the Voidoid, terrible name by the way, is pretty lame though. He has nothing really going for him, he's just a generic evil for evil's sake villain. The costume idea of being a literal white void is conceptually interesting, but this leads to the action with him feeling rather lifeless. It's just Fury fighting a giant blob of empty space. And his power of he can't be touched by anything making him basically unbeatable is immediately invalidated because he puts on this dumbass helmet and gets this dumbass gun to fight Fury. So the only thing that makes him any threat is pointless. The narrative seems to treat him as being a big deal to Fury too, so it just makes him seem like a total chump and not worth the effort. And it may have been deliberate, him being an amorphous white void with no real motive, representing how older villains didn't really have any definable motives or personality. But either way, Moore was aware of this problem because the last few pages go into a total non sequitur when the mystery cargo Fury was guarding turns out to be a mutant psychic T-Rex which goes on a killing spree. Honestly, I wish this was the main focus to start with, because how can you go wrong with psychic T-Rexes? It's goofy and Silver Age as hell, and it's fun watching Fury try and figure out a way to defeat it. The Fury is another pretty good one, but it feels a bit unsure about what it wants here. It feels more concise with making it feel like a random snapshot of a real series, and the callbacks feel more natural, but the actual bulk of the story feels confused and has a bit too many ideas going on at once. The third issue is Tales of the Uncanny, a pastiche of Tales of Suspense, featuring 1963's Captain America and Iron Man XPs, USA and the Hypernaut. USA's story focuses on him trying to solve a mystery he uncovers after stopping the JFK assassination, and Hypernauts has him fighting a mysterious alien from another plane of reality. Conceptually, both stories are really interesting, and I had fun reading them, but both USA and Hypernaut are pretty boring characters. On USA's side, I love all the jokes about the JFK assassination and the various conspiracy angles, the second shooters on the grassy knoll, not Oswald being part of a greater conspiracy, not Ruby being in on the conspiracy and trying to kill not Oswald to keep him from talking. I love that this alternate timeline has basically every component of the actual JFK shooting almost by coincidence, keeping kayfabe in mind. The big twist of the conspiracy being that the real shooter was stopped by another Oswald from the future, maybe, is hilarious and is probably the second best twist on the JFK assassination I've ever seen, only behind JFK himself was the second shooter. USA himself is pretty dull, although I'll chalk that up to him not having much time to really explore his personality, since most of the runtime is dedicated to solving the conspiracy. I like that his powers come from a special drug he has to take, fits with him being a revived Golden Age character, since a lot of Golden Age heroes got their powers from taking special drugs, like Blue Beetle and Hourman. The Red Brain is a fun pastiche of the Red Skull, but other than some good old-fashioned commie bashing, there's not much done with him. I prefer this story over the other one. I'm big into conspiracy stuff like this, so I think it hooked me more. Hypernaut, on the other hand, isn't boring because of lack of time to develop, but rather because there's not much going for him. Most of his dialogue is pseudoscience gobbledygook and pathetic navel-gazing, and it feels like he's trying to seem really deep and intellectual, but it's all just meaningless fluff. Much like the Mystery Inc. story, too much time is spent on pointless callbacks and showing off all of Hypernaut's cool shit, although with a lower page count, it's paced out a bit better, I suppose. The monster's got a really cool gimmick. I'm a sucker for villains and creatures that come from higher levels of dimensions and reality, and it's used well. It's got a really creepy design, and the explanation of, since it comes from a higher dimensional plane, it wouldn't look exactly the same as it would where it came from, and we would only be able to perceive parts of it. And it ties in with how the creature is defeated too. And I like how they have it start messing with the nature of the comic book reality it's in. It's a very interesting concept, but it's not used enough for my liking. I don't like this one as much as the other half, but it's a fun, hard sci-fi story, and Hypernaut has a really cool design. I like the featureless orb head and the chest piece with the big screen with the actual face on it. It's a very surreal look. Oh, and Hypernaut has a weird space monkey sidekick. No, I don't know why. It doesn't do anything really, it's just there. The fourth issue is a pastiche of Tales to Astonish called Tales from Beyond, focusing on the Hulk XP, the N-Man, and the Doctor Strange XP, Johnny Beyond. N-Man's part is lame, so I'm going to rush through this part. N-Man is sent into atomic bomb testing site to investigate mysterious disturbances, and does battle with a mutant Kami who's also come to investigate the disturbance. N-Man isn't all that much of an interesting character. Granted, I've never much cared for the Hulk either, but no real effort is made to establish him as anything other than the basic level Hulk clone. And other than him working with the government rather than fleeing from them, we don't really get much insight into what his deal is to begin with. Having him explore an atomic weapons test site is a good way to have really surreal and bizarre set pieces, but the environments are rather dull and lack much of anything in the way of exciting or fantastical elements. Although this lake of liquid glass is a cool concept. It's mostly just a brainless fight for a majority of the pages. The villain, Comrade Cockroach, is also pretty boring and is mostly just an excuse for easy commie bashing. Not that there's nothing wrong with commie bashing, fuck the commies, but nothing is really done with him being a mutant roach man. I do really like how they try to humanize him a bit before his death, having him frantically pleading for his life as N-Man struggles to rescue him, only for his efforts to be in vain, and having N-Man be genuinely remorseful for his death is honestly pretty impactful. It wasn't exactly something that happened in the Silver Age, but I think it makes him more interesting in a way. Johnny Beyond, on the other hand, is super interesting, and is honestly my favorite story of the bunch. The story focuses on Johnny offering to help a woman who's lost and disoriented, leading him on a strange journey through space and time. Johnny probably strays the most from the Marvel hero he's parodying. While he's still a mystical caretaker of supernatural shenanigans, Johnny's a smooth-walking, jive-talking beatnik who's well-versed in what's hip and happening. I like the carefree attitude and overly optimistic outlook. It serves for a great contrast for the twisted and bizarre happenings of the story and makes him immediately endearing. Moore doesn't go too far with the 60s hip lingo with Johnny either. While pretty much every line he has contains at least one or two different slang terms, it's never to the point where you can't understand the intended meaning of what's trying to be conveyed, which is a common flaw with retro throwbacks like this, where they make the dialects and terminology so convoluted, the dialogue is incomprehensible to the average person. Despite the short page count, a lot of work is put into fleshing out the setting Johnny occupies without bogging it down with pointless callbacks to shit that never actually happened. And the story being set in a small, contained setting is good too. The concept of the apartment building's spirit getting twisted up in space-time is well represented by having Johnny slowly come to the realization that something's up by watching his new acquaintance getting closer and closer to where his friend's apartment should be, only to culminate in a totally different place and a doppelganger of himself to boot, is built up really well. I like how it ties into the overall meta-plot too, with the acquaintance being from the future except not quite, and with the shifting of reality and timelines that's going on, it's fairly subtle with the inclusion too, making it a central part of the story without directly calling attention to it. My only major complaint is that it ends on a cliffhanger, since it means I will forever be disappointed not knowing how Johnny Beyond gets out of the danger he's stuck in. But it's honestly the 1963 story I recommend you read the most. The fifth issue is Horus, Lord of Light, an obvious XP of Thor, the story of which focuses on Horus's trip to the home of his fellow gods going completely awry, forcing him to keep watch over Ra during his nightly journey through the gates of the underworld. This one was also really fun, much in the same way that Kirby used a general level of knowledge of Norse mythology to weave surreal, otherworldly stories. Horus uses relatively surface-level info about ancient Egyptian mythology to tell a fascinating story of a bizarre alien realm full of gods. Horus himself is pretty dull, but Silver Age Thor tended to be pretty flat too from my own personal experience, so it's at least accurate. And I found him to be an effective hero, but there's not much I can really say that describes him. The story itself is inventive, with Horus getting manipulated by Set into getting stuck on Ra's solar barge, forcing him to guard Ra during his trip through the nighttime as depicted in Egyptian mythology as a trip through the underworld itself. Not helping matters is a normal human who followed Horus here by stalking Horus's human disguise to the Heliopolis. All of which is an elaborate multi-tier scheme by Set to fuck with Horus. I like how it plays fast and loose with Egyptian mythology. Much like Thor does, it takes the Cliff Notes versions of some mythological figures and elements, while staying relatively accurate to the general depictions for others. It's a very interesting depiction and makes me wonder what the alternate reality where Horus was a real character back then and how that would affect general public perception of certain mythological figures would be like. The designs of the gods and the underworld is my favorite part of it. Lots of absurd geometry and vibrant colors, with a heavy emphasis on symmetrical and angled line work, while incorporating elements and iconography of the classic depictions of the gods. They're all really inventive, and they replicate Kirby's design philosophy well. And now finally, the 1963 metaplot coalesces and comes into the spotlight, kicking off with the 6th issue, the Tomorrow Syndicate, the obligatory Avengers XP featuring USA, Horus, Hypernaut, N-Man, and the newly appearing Inframan and Infragirl, XPs of Ant-Man and Wasp. Throughout each individual story up to this point, each member of the Syndicate receives an urgent message from Inframan, calling them for an urgent meeting. Picking up from the events of issue 2, where the Fury's enemy Voidoid uses mysterious technology to try and kill him, Fury turns over the tech to definitely not the Inframan's secret identity, who discovers the tech gives off a strange energy signal that's also coming from the Mystery Inc.'s secret base, leading to the Tomorrow Syndicate heading out to investigate, and leading to them to take a trip to the Mystery Inc.'s dimensional portal to try and see just what in the actual fuck is going on here. I think spending the time to establish all the characters and the setting made this one more enjoyable. A lot of this one is mostly just cheap multiverse jokes. Interesting that even by 1993 people were sick of multiverse stuff. I do like the way the team's dynamic is portrayed, and how you can tell that even working together, they still have their own motives and they have trouble putting that aside. I will admit the jokes about the multiverse being a giant bureaucracy and hero crossovers are a bit stale, although they're so overdone nowadays that I don't know how much of that is just overall fatigue or them just not being that funny here. But the actual journey throughout, looking for Mystery Inc. is diverse enough to be interesting. Them meeting an evil version of the Syndicate and the obligatory fight that goes along, several stops to worlds where events that happen in real life went differently, resulting in disaster, a few stops in utterly bizarre worlds where nothing makes sense, and my favorite point being when they reach the effective center of the multiverse, being able to see essentially all realities at once, leading to a big splash page filled with cameos from so many other indie books. You've got Cerebus, Flaming Carrot, the Max Immortal from Brat Pack, the Understanding Comics guy, and a few others that I can't quite recognize off the top of my head, but the editorial column has the full list for those interested. The overall look of the multiverse is quite fascinating as well, but being largely a vehicle for these different set pieces, the heroes don't really do anything. So again, I'm glad that they bothered to establish most of them beforehand, the exceptions being Inframan and Infragirl, neither of whom really do anything because Inframan is a nerd and Infragirl is a woman. Them searching for Mystery Inc. is also largely just an excuse to get them here, since the Syndicate largely blunders their way through on the journey, and only seems to find their way to where they need to go by accident. But the story finally builds to a shocking climax, when the Syndicate makes their way to the source of the mysterious signal, a world that's wrong on a conceptual level to them, and the mysterious intruder returns from the ending of issue 1, taunting Kid Dynamo as he unmasks, revealing himself to be Shaft from Youngblood, as we lead into the final part of 1963, a massive 80-page crossover between the heroes of 1963 and some of the biggest heroes of 1993. There's just one tiny little problem with that. It doesn't exist. See, now we get into the biggest issue with 1963, in that the final issue, the thesis statement for what Moore and company were trying to go for, the entire linchpin to understand what the point of the work was never released, and apparently never even finished to begin with. Now, the problem that often arises with discussing an unfinished work is that, without the final part of the story, it's often impossible to properly discern the intended meaning behind the work, thus leaving any possible interpretation of the themes just as valid as another, making it rather difficult to truly understand the author's point. Now, fortunately, just enough about the final issue has been revealed over the years, to at the very least figure out what the intended message behind the metaplot of the series was. Although the exact details of the final issue and what the actual ending was supposed to be is still a mystery. Based on what we know from early mentions of the finale included in the letters columns and editorial pages of the book, the intent for the ending was to have the Tomorrow Syndicate, Fury, Johnny Beyond, and Mystery Inc. end up in what was essentially the modern day, or in this case, the modern state of the comics industry of 1993, where they would have met and fought against the A-listers of Image, featuring not just Youngblood, but Spawn, Savage Dragon, Shadowhawk, the Wildcats, and Supreme. The intended meaning behind 1963 and this crossover was effectively a commentary on the failings of the Marvel style, how their push for overall more thematically grounded and dramatic stories during the era, as opposed to the standard Silver Age style of just do fucking whatever, created a domino effect which directly contributed to the extreme grimdark violence and edginess of the late 80s and early to mid 90s comics industry, and the effective death of the superhero genre. Ironic, considering Moore is also responsible for this in a way through Watchmen, but he's at least self-aware of that fact, so I'll let it slide. As is, it's difficult to tell that's the intended message of 1983, but not outright impossible. It's easy enough to interpret that's the case, seeing the setup at the end, although still open enough to leave multiple guesses. So what exactly happened? Well, the official version of events goes like this. After the 1963 project begins work, Jim Lee is announced to be handling the art of the final issue, and work begins on the script for it. However, Lee announces rather suddenly that he's going to be taking a year-long break from the industry as a whole, and instead of just passing the issue on to another artist since no work had actually started on it yet, the script is put aside and the project is put into limbo. This ended up being an effective death sentence for the book, as by the time Lee had returned, he had given himself so much extra work he couldn't even begin to start working on it. This is of course the official reasoning. Taking Steve Bissett's commentary into account, what had actually happened was that Steve, Rick, and Alan had offered another Image head, Jim Valentino, a spot in the book after he brought them into Image to make the series, and Jim Lee decided he wanted a piece of the project and coerced them into letting him work on it, stonewalling Valentino and stealing the thunder of the whole project, never seeming to actually intend to work on it in any way. Whether that's the case or not, things were only made worse when about a year after Lee's return, Rob Liefeld quit Image and went solo, resulting in Youngblood and Supreme now being effectively off limits. Moore essentially gave up after this, with the state of the industry having shifted enough in those few years where the dark and edgy format the series was satirizing was largely falling out of relevance, with self-criticism of the era becoming more and more prevalent in the time since. Moore and Bissett had a falling out at some point over the years over God knows what, which more or less killed the 1963 project permanently. Several attempts to either continue or reprint the work over the years have gone nowhere, largely due to either one party or another refusing to want to work together anymore, resulting in the series to more or less fade into obscurity. It makes a lot of the way Moore presents himself and the relationships he has with Bissett and Veitch in the kayfabe of 1963 rather ironic in hindsight, portraying himself as this egotistical slave driver who only cares about Bissett and Veitch for production of comics and not as friends or co-workers. The kayfabe aspect is particularly interesting, serving as a contrast to the books themselves and as the primary source of satire, portraying an exaggerated version of the Marvel offices and work culture at the time, with Moore writing himself as a borderline saint and a lovable, friendly guy, when behind the scenes he's a gigantic egotistical asshole who takes credit for other people's work, runs a borderline sweatshop, or literal I suppose since they outright call it one, and the overall disrespect and poor treatment of workers. Most of the satire isn't especially obvious if one isn't familiar with what Marvel was like in those days, but since Moore tries to make it obvious that he's aping Marvel, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out. Discussion of the work-for-hire nature of contracts, poor working conditions and horrible mismanagement, hypocritical views on both treatment of women and racial/political acceptance, the low level of quality control almost bizarrely encouraged by mock-awarding readers for finding them, and so much more. It's pretty scathing all around, with plenty of pot shots taken at Stan Lee in particular, criticizing the Marvel method and his own ego, the downplaying of nepotism being what led to his rise in power, with Moore copying his particular writing quirks and cadences with a whole host of snappy catchphrases and overly jolly attitude, even when writing demeaning insults or threatening people with lawsuits. And an overabundance of alliteration to make himself seem intelligent, although by the last issue it's evolved into nearly whole paragraphs of alliteration, resulting in an absolutely maddening sensation attempting to read it all. It is fairly effective in its goal at mocking Marvel, but at points it does feel like it goes a bit too overboard. Not in the sense that it's too mean, but more in the sense that it starts to break the kayfabe that's established. By having affable Al's more jackass behaviors bleed into the comic proper, although whether that was the intent as the final issue would show or not, I can't say. But overall, there's a great attention to detail with the editorial segments. They really capture the spirit and replicate the overall feel of old Marvel, and the fake letters page as well is a pretty impressive facsimile. It helps that they're all fake, so the exact tone can be controlled. The fake advertisements are a great touch as well. They're wacky, but not to the point of being too farcical, and nearly every ad is a parody of an actual ad that ran at the time. I'm always a sucker for jokey old-time ads, so it's a personal fave of mine. The overall presentation and attention to detail is impressive, although some of it is hard to tell without a physical copy. According to interviews, they deliberately sought out the same printing equipment and paper stock to replicate the old-timey feel and look of the era as perfectly as possible, and this carries over to the art as well. Veitch, Bissett, Valentino, and all the other artists do a fantastic job at replicating the aesthetics of the era as best as they can. Veitch primarily aping Jack Kirby's stylings, and managed to pretty faithfully replicate his designs and his particular artistic quirks. Bissett, on the other hand, seems to go for more of a copy of the aesthetics of the day rather than a copy of a specific artist, although he does ape a bit of Ditko here and there. My only real issue is that the art and coloring is a bit too clean and often a bit too detailed to really match the Silver Age style, but you can only go so far with replicating something without trying to deliberately copy the shittier aspects of it intentionally after all. I wish they stuck a bit harder to the kayfabe nature of it. They start to stray from it as it goes on and begin to make references and comments on more topical elements as opposed to trying to stick to it being as if it is actually made in 1963. But since it's not a significant part of the experience, I can't say it harms the work overall. 1963 certainly accomplishes its primary task at being a retro throwback to the classic era of comics. But without the final issue to tie everything together, it's stuck in an uncomfortable position. While it still manages to stand on its own, without the final issue to complete the piece, it's left in an unenviable position where it can't properly convey the message without outside information to fill in the void. This makes it hard to judge the overall quality of the work and how effective the message was, and makes discussing the work overall hard. But I would say it's a success. It managed to get me interested in the characters and stories pretty well overall, and the stories themselves were entertaining snapshots into a series that will never be. The level of dedication put into making them seem like they are genuine stories from a forgotten comic is impressive, but expected from everyone involved. If you're fond of Marvel's main staples or big into metafiction, I would give it a solid recommendation. The level of effort put in is impressive, with Moore & Co. going so far to give kayfabe interviews for the series and help to try explain the metafictional universe they've designed for themselves, and the dedication isn't wasted. It's a shame that it'll never be complete, but it's better that we got part of it rather than none of it, I suppose. And on that note, I believe that's all for this time. This has been Jay, and as I return to the void between pages, I look forward to when next we may meet, and I can share what else I've been reading.